On their 25th anniversary, Elena Blackwood collapses at dinner, setting off a chain of shocking revelations. As hidden identities surface and a deadly conspiracy unravels, Elena must confront the ultimate betrayal and face a terrifying secret from her past. Will she uncover the truth before it's too late? Lucille sparkled that evening, the soft glow of chandeliers reflecting off polished silverware and delicate crystal glasses. The restaurant, perched high above the city, was known for its exclusivity, catering to those who had the wealth and the taste to appreciate its culinary art. Tonight, it was graced by Richard and Elena Blackwood, a couple who, despite the passage of 25 years, still turned heads. Richard, tall and distinguished with a silver streak in his hair that matched the crispness of his tailored suit, exuded a confidence that came with power and success. Elena, with her flawless elegance, had an air of grace that years hadn't dimmed. They had chosen Lucille to celebrate their milestone anniversary, the kind of place where the atmosphere was as intoxicating as the wine. At their private table by the window, they had a panoramic view of the city lights, a sight that had always captivated Elena. She smiled across the table at Richard as she raised her glass, the fine bubbles of champagne catching the light as they danced toward the surface. "To us," she said softly, her voice full of the affection that had grown over decades. "To 25 more," Richard replied, his smile warm but his eyes distant, as if already lost in the memories they had made together. Elena opened her mouth to respond, but the words never came. Instead, her hand flew to her chest, her face contorting in sudden pain. The glass slipped from her fingers, shattering on the table before falling to the floor, as she collapsed back into her chair. "Richard," her voice was a choked whisper, panic flooding her eyes. For a moment, Richard was frozen, unable to comprehend what was happening. Then the restaurant erupted into chaos. Diners at nearby tables gasped and murmured in alarm, waitstaff rushing to their side. Richard, his heart pounding, scrambled to his feet and reached for Elena, calling her name as he fumbled with his phone to dial emergency services. Within seconds, a small crowd had formed around their table, voices overlapping in a frantic attempt to help. Someone had already called for an ambulance, while others suggested what to do in the meantime. A young waiter, his face pale, began administering CPR under the hurried direction of a doctor who had rushed over from a neighboring table. Richard watched, helpless, his mind racing and his stomach knotted with dread. Minutes felt like hours before the paramedics arrived, their entrance parting the anxious crowd like a knife through fabric. They moved with practiced precision, taking over from the well-meaning but out-of-their-depth onlookers. Richard stepped back, his legs unsteady, as they worked on Elena, checking her pulse, applying oxygen, and continuing the chest compressions that seemed to have little effect. Is she going to be okay?" Richard asked, his voice cracking with fear. The paramedics didn't answer, their focus entirely on Elena as they prepared her for transport. The room seemed to blur around him as they lifted her onto a stretcher, the clatter of wheels on the marble floor echoing in the suddenly hushed restaurant. As they rushed Elena out, Richard followed, his heart thudding in his chest as he struggled to keep up with the rapid pace of the paramedics. The cold night air hit him like a slap when they exited the building, but he barely noticed, his entire world narrowed to the woman lying unconscious on the stretcher. The ambulance doors slammed shut behind her, and Richard climbed into the front, his hands trembling as he fumbled with his seatbelt. The ride to St. Mary's Hospital was a blur of flashing lights and sirens, the city rushing by in a haze. Richard's thoughts were a chaotic swirl. This was not how the evening was supposed to go. They were supposed to toast to their life together, to the memories they had made, to the future they still had ahead of them. Instead, he was racing through the streets, his wife's life hanging in the balance. When they arrived at the hospital, the paramedics wasted no time, wheeling Elena through the emergency room doors as nurses and doctors converged on them. Richard stumbled after them, his heart in his throat, but a nurse gently stopped him from following them into the trauma room. "Please, sir, you need to wait here," she said, her tone firm but compassionate. "We'll take care of her." Richard nodded numbly, sinking into a plastic chair in the waiting area. His mind raced, flipping through the possibilities of what could have gone wrong. Elena had been fine, perfectly fine, just moments before. They had been talking, laughing, enjoying their evening, and then, this. He couldn't make sense of it. He didn't want to. The minutes dragged on, each one an eternity as Richard sat there, staring at the closed doors that led to the room where Elena was fighting for her life. He had never felt so powerless. In his world, problems were things to be solved, obstacles to be overcome, but this was something he couldn't control, couldn't fix. The realization settled in his chest like a lead weight. Finally, a doctor emerged, his expression grave. Richard leapt to his feet, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Mr. Blackwood?" the doctor asked, his voice gentle, yet with a professional distance that Richard immediately resented. "Yes, that's me." "How is she? Is she going to be okay?" The questions tumbled out of him, desperate and raw. The doctor hesitated, just a fraction of a second, but it was enough to send a jolt of fear through Richard. "We're doing everything we can," he said carefully. "But it's too soon to say. She's stable for now, but we need to run more tests to understand what caused this. We'll keep you updated." Richard nodded, not trusting himself to speak. As the doctor turned to leave, Richard sat back down, his hands gripping the armrests of the chair so tightly his knuckles turned white. The noise of the hospital buzzed around him, phones ringing, the shuffle of footsteps, the low murmur of conversations, but it all felt distant, like he was underwater. This was supposed to be their night, a celebration of all they had shared and all they had to look forward to. Instead, it had become a nightmare, one that Richard couldn't wake up from. And so, he waited, alone with his thoughts, the weight of uncertainty pressing down on him as the minutes ticked by, each one bringing him closer to answers he wasn't sure he wanted to hear. Mariana had always moved quietly through the corridors of St. Mary's Hospital, her footsteps soft against the polished linoleum floors. Years of experience as a cleaner had taught her to blend into the background, unnoticed and unremarkable. She preferred it that way. It was safer. The less people knew about her, the fewer questions they asked. But that night, as she passed by the trauma room where Elena Blackwood had been admitted, something made her pause. The sounds of the hospital were familiar to her, the hum of fluorescent lights, the distant murmur of doctors discussing cases, the beep of machines monitoring life and death. But what she heard now was different, a hurried conversation that caught her attention. "She's stable, but we need to be cautious. Whatever caused this, it's not typical," a voice said, tense with concern. Mariana lingered near the slightly ajar door, her hands tightening around the handle of her mop. She knew she shouldn't be eavesdropping, but something compelled her to stay. She heard another voice, softer, almost inaudible. "Dr. Hayes, do you think it could have been intentional? Poison?" Her breath caught in her throat. Poison? She didn't need to hear more. Her instinct screamed at her to walk away, but her feet remained rooted to the spot. The nurse inside the room spoke again, quieter now, as though trying to keep her words from escaping the confines of the room. But Mariana heard it all. "We found a faint rash on her wrist, and a strange birthmark just below it. It might be significant. We need to run more tests." A birthmark. A rash. Mariana's heart began to race, memories flashing through her mind like a reel of film suddenly set in motion. She felt dizzy, gripping the mop handle so tightly her knuckles whitened. She knew that birthmark. She would never forget it. The door suddenly opened, and Mariana took a step back, quickly lowering her eyes as the doctor and nurse exited the room. They didn't notice her, too caught up in their conversation, and she used the opportunity to slip away, retreating to the nearest supply closet where she could be alone. Once inside, she leaned against the wall, closing her eyes to steady herself. The past she had buried so deeply, the life she had left behind, came rushing back, unstoppable as a flood. She had seen that birthmark before, on a tiny wrist decades ago, in a different world, a different life. Mariana was not always a cleaner. There had been a time when she wore a white coat, when people addressed her as doctor. Back then, in her home country, she had been a medical prodigy, her future bright and full of promise. She had a gift for healing, an innate understanding of the human body that set her apart. But that gift had also been her curse. In those days, her country was torn by conflict, and the hospitals were often filled with victims of violence. She had done what she could, saving lives when possible, easing pain when it wasn't. But it wasn't enough. Corruption ran deep, and she had found herself caught in its web. When she refused to turn a blind eye to the atrocities around her, they came for her. Her career, her family, her life, they took everything. She fled, leaving behind a life of prestige and respect for one of anonymity and fear. And now, after all these years, the past was staring her in the face in the form of a woman lying in a hospital bed, fighting for her life. The memory of that birthmark, the distinct crescent shape, brought back another face, one she had tried to forget. Elena's mother. The woman she had delivered under the cover of night, her screams muffled by the chaos of war. Mariana had barely been an adult herself, yet she had held that tiny, fragile life in her hands, and she had promised to protect her. But that promise had been broken when Elena was taken away, spirited off to a place Mariana could never reach. Mariana had long wondered what had become of the child. And now, by some twist of fate, she had found her again. But what did it mean? What was she supposed to do? The fear that had driven her into hiding all those years ago surged back with a vengeance, mixing with a deep, aching guilt. She had vowed to leave that part of herself behind when she came to this country. Here, she was just a cleaner, someone who swept floors and emptied trash bins. She wasn't a doctor anymore. She wasn't the woman who had once believed she could change the world. But as she thought of Elena, lying there so vulnerable, something inside her began to stir. The cleaner's uniform suddenly felt suffocating, as though it were a mask she could no longer bear to wear. She could help Elena, she knew that. There was a part of her that had never forgotten the skills she had once mastered. But revealing her true identity was a risk. If she came forward, if she let herself be seen for who she really was, it could mean the end of the life she had carefully constructed. And then there was Richard Blackwood. His name was not unfamiliar to her, though she had never met him. She had heard rumors, whispers of his involvement in unsavory dealings. If he was connected to Elena's collapse, could she trust him? Could she trust anyone? As these thoughts battled within her, she was overwhelmed by an image of Elena's wrist, the birthmark that had triggered these memories. It was a sign, a connection she couldn't ignore. But what could she do? What should she do? Mariana pressed a hand to her chest, feeling the rapid thud of her heartbeat. She needed time to think, to weigh her options. But time was a luxury Elena might not have. If what she had overheard was true, if Elena had been poisoned, then every second mattered. The urge to run, to disappear again, was strong. But another part of her, the part that had once driven her to become a doctor, the part that had once believed in doing the right thing no matter the cost, whispered to her to stay, to fight. She had been a coward once, letting fear dictate her actions, but could she do that again? Could she live with herself if she turned her back on Elena, her own flesh and blood? Mariana stood there, caught between her past and her present, her fear and her conscience. She had a choice to make, one that would define not just her own future, but possibly save Elena's life. The bright, sterile lights of the trauma room cast an unforgiving glare on the frantic scene below. Doctors and nurses worked in tight, synchronized motions, their faces drawn with concentration and a hint of desperation. The machines that monitored Elena's vital signs had fallen silent, their beeping replaced by a single, ominous tone that echoed through the room. Richard Blackwood stood just outside the door, watching through the glass as the team worked on his wife. His heart pounded in his chest, every second that passed stretching into an eternity. He could barely breathe as he saw them apply the defibrillator paddles to Elena's chest once more, her body jolting with the electric shock. The doctor in charge, a man with graying hair and the weight of years etched into his face, leaned over Elena, listening for a heartbeat, any sign of life. But there was nothing. Richard felt the air thicken around him as he saw the doctor shake his head, a small, defeated motion that hit him like a punch to the gut. He couldn't hear the words that were exchanged among the medical team, but their body language spoke volumes. The nurse closest to the door looked up, meeting Richard's eyes with a sorrowful gaze that told him everything he needed to know. "No," Richard whispered, his voice cracking as he pushed through the door. "No, you can't stop. You have to keep trying." The doctor looked at him, his eyes filled with a mix of pity and professionalism. "Mr. Blackwood, I'm sorry. We've done everything we can. There's nothing more." Richard didn't let him finish. "You're wrong," he snapped, desperation seeping into his tone. "You haven't done everything. You can't give up on her." The doctor remained calm, but there was a finality in his voice that cut through Richard's denial. "We've tried multiple rounds of resuscitation, but there's no response. We have to call it." "No!" Richard's voice rose, but before he could say more, the door to the room burst open, slamming against the wall with a force that made everyone jump. Mariana stood in the doorway, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and determination. For a moment, the room seemed to freeze, everyone staring at this intruder in her cleaning uniform, out of place among the sterile scrubs and lab coats. But Mariana didn't hesitate. She pushed past the stunned medical team, moving to Elena's side with a speed that left no room for protest. "What are you doing?" the doctor demanded, stepping forward to intervene. But Mariana was already in motion, her hands moving over Elena's still form with a familiarity that belied her appearance. She reached into the pocket of her uniform and pulled out a small vial and a syringe, her movements practiced and precise. "This is highly irregular," the doctor protested, trying to pull her away. "You're not authorized." "I don't need your authorization," Mariana snapped, her voice filled with a confidence that silenced him. She didn't look up, her focus entirely on Elena as she filled the syringe with a quick, sure hand. Richard, caught between shock and a desperate hope, watched in silence as Mariana bent over his wife. The room was filled with tension, the medical staff unsure whether to stop her or step back and let her work. Something in the way she moved, the way she carried herself, made them hesitate. Mariana found the spot she was looking for, just below Elena's collarbone, and injected the contents of the syringe directly into the muscle. Then, without pausing, she began a series of chest compressions, her hands strong and steady. The seconds ticked by, each one a lifetime, as the team around her watched, holding their breath. Then, as if in response to some invisible command, Elena's body jerked. Her eyes flew open, wide with panic, as she gasped in a deep, desperate breath. The machines, which had been silent, suddenly came to life, their beeping a chaotic symphony of renewed life. For a moment, no one moved. The shock was palpable, a wave that washed over everyone in the room. Richard's knees nearly gave way as he saw his wife's chest rise and fall, her breath ragged but undeniably there. What just happened?" the doctor stammered, his composure shattered by the impossible scene unfolding before him. Mariana stepped back, her own breath coming in gasps, her eyes fixed on Elena with a look that was part relief, part something deeper, more complicated. She didn't answer the doctor's question, her mind still reeling from what she had just done. She had acted on instinct, on a knowledge she had buried long ago, and it had worked. But the implications of what had just happened, the questions it would raise, were already starting to swirl in her mind. Richard was the first to find his voice, though it was thick with emotion. How did you do that? What did you do?" Mariana looked at him, her eyes dark with secrets she had kept for too long. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. How could she explain what she herself didn't fully understand? How could she tell them who she really was, why she had been able to save Elena when all the doctors had failed? The doctor, regaining some of his composure, stepped forward. "That was an unorthodox procedure," he said, his tone still laced with disbelief. "You need to explain yourself." Mariana knew she owed them an explanation, but where to begin? She could feel their eyes on her, the weight of their expectations heavy on her shoulders. She looked at Elena, who was now breathing on her own, her skin regaining some of its color. For a moment, the only sound was the steady beeping of the heart monitor, a reminder that against all odds, Elena was alive. Finally, Mariana spoke, her voice low but steady. "I was once a doctor, in another life. What I did just now, it was something I learned a long time ago. A technique, one that isn't recognized here, but it works. It saved her life." The doctor frowned, clearly skeptical but unable to deny the evidence before him. "We'll need to review everything," he said, his tone still edged with disbelief. "This needs to be reported." Mariana nodded, knowing there would be consequences for what she had done, for revealing the part of herself she had tried so hard to keep hidden. But as she looked at Elena, alive and breathing, she knew she had made the right choice. No matter what happened next, she had fulfilled a promise she had made long ago, to protect the life she had once brought into the world. Richard, his eyes never leaving Mariana, simply said, "Thank you." The words were heavy with emotion, with a gratitude so profound it defied expression. Mariana only nodded in response, her thoughts already spinning with the questions that would surely follow, the truths that would soon come to light. She had saved Elena's life, but in doing so, she had also exposed her own. The secrets she had kept hidden were now poised to unravel, and with them everything she had worked so hard to build. The tension in the air at St. Mary's Hospital was palpable as the investigation into Elena Blackwood's miraculous revival deepened. What had started as a routine inquiry into an extraordinary medical event had quickly spiraled into something far more complex. The hospital administrators, now embroiled in a scandal they hadn't anticipated, had initiated a thorough investigation into Mariana. Questions swirled around her background, her credentials, or lack thereof, and how she had managed to do what the seasoned doctors couldn't. It didn't take long for the first pieces of Mariana's true identity to emerge. The staff at the hospital had known her as a quiet, unobtrusive cleaning lady, someone who blended into the background with the ease of someone accustomed to being overlooked. But the Mariana they discovered during the investigation was a woman with a past far more illustrious, and far more troubled, than anyone could have imagined. Mariana Alvarez had once been a name spoken with reverence in medical circles. In her home country, she had been a pioneering surgeon, celebrated for her innovative techniques and her unyielding dedication to her patients. Her reputation had extended beyond borders, earning her accolades from prestigious institutions around the world. But all of that had been stripped away in a single, devastating moment. As the investigation delved deeper, the reasons for Mariana's fall from grace became clear. She had been a rising star until she became entangled in a political scandal that had nothing to do with her work and everything to do with the corrupt powers that ruled her homeland. Her refusal to comply with the unethical demands of powerful men had made her a target. The consequences were swift and brutal. Her medical license was revoked, her reputation smeared with lies, and she was forced into exile, leaving behind the life she had built and the child she had brought into the world under the most harrowing circumstances. Richard Blackwood's name appeared repeatedly in the murky details of Mariana's past, a ghost that haunted every corner of her downfall. He had been a young businessman then, ambitious and ruthless, with connections that ran deep in the very government that had destroyed Mariana's career. While the investigation couldn't definitively prove his involvement in the conspiracy against her, the circumstantial evidence was damning. Richard had been in the right places at the right times, benefiting from the chaos that followed Mariana's expulsion from the country. Elena, still weak from her ordeal, was thrust into a maelstrom of revelations that left her reeling. The hospital, once a place of healing, had become a battleground of emotions, secrets, and lies. She spent her days recuperating in a private room, her mind a storm of confusion as the pieces of her life were rearranged before her eyes. The DNA test had been suggested by one of the doctors, a formality at first, intended to rule out any possible connections between the woman who had saved her life and the patient she had saved. But when the results came back, they turned Elena's world upside down. Mariana wasn't just a stranger with a mysterious past, she was Elena's biological mother. The news hit Elena like a physical blow. She had always known she was adopted, but her parents had told her nothing about her origins, and she had never questioned them. To learn now, after so many years, that the woman who had brought her back from the brink of death was the mother she had never known, was more than she could process. The walls of her hospital room seemed to close in on her as she tried to reconcile the life she had lived with the new reality thrust upon her. She had always thought of herself as Elena Blackwood, daughter of Richard and Margaret Blackwood, a child of privilege and wealth. But now, she wasn't sure who she was anymore. The face she saw in the mirror was suddenly a stranger's, her identity fragmented by the truth. Richard had been by her side through the initial shock, his concern palpable. But Elena couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Her father, always so composed, seemed too controlled, too ready with reassurances that rang hollow in her ears. She had sensed a tension in him that hadn't been there before, a tightness in his voice whenever Mariana's name was mentioned. It was as if he knew more than he was letting on, and the thought gnawed at her. It wasn't long before Elena began to dig deeper, despite her father's protests that she needed rest, that she should focus on her recovery. But rest was impossible with so many questions swirling in her mind, each one more urgent than the last. Late one night, when the hospital was quiet and the lights in her room dimmed, Elena confronted Richard. She asked him directly, her voice trembling with the weight of her suspicions. "Did you know, Dad? Did you know who she was, who I am?" Richard's face, usually so unreadable, betrayed a flicker of something, guilt, perhaps, or regret. It was enough to confirm her fears. "Elena, he began, but the words caught in his throat. For the first time in her life, Elena saw her father at a loss, his usual confidence crumbling under the weight of the truth. "You did know," Elena said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You knew, and you didn't tell me. Why?" Richard looked away, his jaw tightening as he struggled with his next words. "It was complicated. Your mother and we wanted to protect you." "Protect me?" Elena repeated, disbelief coloring her tone. "From what? From my own mother? Or from the truth?" Richard's silence was answer enough. The anger that had been simmering in Elena's heart began to boil over. She felt betrayed, not just by the man she had called her father, but by the life she had believed was hers. Everything she had known, everything she had trusted, was unraveling, and Richard's betrayal cut the deepest. "Do you even know what you've done?" Elena continued, her voice rising. "You took me away from her, from my real mother. You lied to me, my whole life. How could you?" Richard finally met her gaze, his eyes full of a pain that mirrored her own. "Elena, I did what I thought was best. There are things you don't understand." "No," Elena interrupted, her voice sharp. "You did what was best for you. You destroyed her life, and you took me as part of the bargain. How can I ever trust you again?" The silence that followed was heavy with finality. Richard's shoulders slumped as the weight of his actions pressed down on him. He knew there was no excuse, no justification that would make this right. The truth had shattered the fragile trust between them, leaving nothing but the jagged edges of betrayal. Elena turned away from him, her heart breaking not just for herself, but for Mariana, the mother she had never known, and the life she had been denied. She felt adrift, lost in a sea of lies that threatened to drown her. The father she had adored had become a stranger, and the woman who had saved her life was now the only anchor she had left. But even that connection was fraught with pain and questions that had no easy answers. Elena's world had become a tangle of secrets, each more twisted than the last. The hospital room, once a place of healing, now felt more like a cage, closing in on her as new revelations threatened to suffocate her. The truth about her parentage, the dark history of her father's involvement in Mariana's downfall, had shattered the fragile identity she'd clung to for so long. But the blows kept coming, and this time, they carried the sharp sting of betrayal. The police arrived not long after the DNA results confirmed Mariana as Elena's biological mother. They weren't there to investigate a miraculous revival, they were there to probe a possible crime. The attending physician's suspicions about Elena's sudden collapse had grown, fed by the anomalies in her symptoms, the unexplained rash, and the toxicology report that pointed toward poisoning. What had been a medical emergency was now being treated as an attempted murder. Detective Mark Hansen was assigned to the case, a man known for his methodical approach and unflinching pursuit of the truth. He stood by Elena's bedside, his sharp eyes taking in every detail, from the dark circles under her eyes to the tension in her voice as she answered his questions. Richard hovered nearby, a shadow of the man he had once been, his usual confidence eroded by the events of the past few days. "Elena," Hansen began, his tone measured but firm, "we're looking into the possibility that your collapse wasn't an accident. The toxicology report suggests you may have been poisoned. We're considering all possible suspects, including anyone who might have had access to you in the hours leading up to your collapse." Elena felt the ground shift beneath her once more. Poisoned. The word echoed in her mind, filling her with a cold, creeping dread. Who would want to do that to me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "That's what we're trying to determine," Hansen replied, his gaze flickering to Richard. "We'll be speaking with everyone who had contact with you that night. Your father, his business associates, even past acquaintances. We have to consider every possibility." Richard bristled at the implication, his voice rising defensively. "You don't seriously think I had something to do with this, do you? I would never harm my daughter." Hansen remained unruffled, his expression unreadable. "We're not accusing anyone, Mr. Blackwood. We're just gathering facts." Elena looked at her father, searching his face for some sign of the man she had trusted all her life. But all she saw now were shadows of doubt, of deception, of secrets she had never known existed. The man who had raised her, who had shaped her into the woman she was, was suddenly a stranger, and that realization chilled her to the bone. "Who else are you investigating?" Elena asked, forcing herself to stay calm, though her heart raced with anxiety. Hansen glanced at his notes. "We're looking into a few people. Your father's business partner, for one. He had dinner with you both that night, correct?" Elena nodded, recalling the smooth-talking man who had always been like an uncle to her. Victor Landry had been part of her life for as long as she could remember, his charm and easy smile a constant presence at family events. But now, that smile seemed sinister, the charm a mask hiding darker intentions. "We're also looking into someone from your past," Hansen continued, his voice careful, as if he were treading on delicate ground. "An ex-lover of yours, Daniel Porter. There were some unresolved issues between you two?" Elena felt her stomach twist at the mention of Daniel. Their relationship had been a whirlwind of passion and betrayal, a chapter of her life she had tried to forget. But Daniel had never truly gone away. He had lingered at the edges of her life, a persistent reminder of mistakes she wished she could erase. The thought that he might harbor a grudge strong enough to lead to something as monstrous as poisoning made her feel ill. "And then there's Mariana," Hansen said, his tone shifting as he mentioned her mother's name. "Her involvement in your revival was unconventional, to say the least. We have to consider her motives as well." "Motives?" Elena repeated, a spark of anger flaring in her chest. "She saved my life." "Perhaps," Hansen conceded. "But we have to look at all possibilities. Revenge can take many forms. If she blames your father for what happened to her, she might see you as part of that." Elena shook her head, unwilling to believe that the woman who had brought her back from the brink of death could have had any hand in causing her collapse in the first place. But the seeds of doubt had been planted, and they were growing, spreading their roots through her already fragile sense of reality. As Hansen left the room, promising to keep them informed, Elena felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. She sank back into the pillows, her mind racing with the implications of what she had just heard. Was her father capable of poisoning her? Could Victor, the man she had always trusted, have done something so heinous? And Daniel, could his bitterness have driven him to this? The questions battered her, each one a blow to the carefully constructed life she had thought was solid, unshakable. But it was Mariana's involvement that gnawed at her the most. Mariana, who had brought her into the world, who had saved her life, was now under suspicion. The thought of her mother, her real mother, being capable of such a betrayal was unbearable. Yet the doubts lingered, insidious and persistent. Elena's thoughts spiraled further as she tried to make sense of everything. The more she dug into her past, the more she realized how little she truly knew about her own life. It wasn't just the poisoning that troubled her, it was the realization that everything she had taken for granted, everything she had believed, might be a lie. Her father's lies had been the first to unravel, but now it seemed there was an entire web of deception woven around her, each thread leading to more questions, more uncertainty. How much of her life had been manipulated, controlled by forces she hadn't even known existed? How many of the people she had trusted had been hiding the truth from her? As night fell, Elena lay awake, her mind refusing to rest. The web of lies that surrounded her was tightening, each revelation a new thread pulling her further into the darkness. She felt trapped, ensnared by secrets and betrayals that she had never seen coming. The truth was out there, somewhere, but it was buried deep beneath layers of deceit, and Elena knew she would have to dig through each one, no matter how painful, to find it. But with every step she took toward the truth, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was getting closer to something far more dangerous. And the closer she got, the more she realized that some lies might be better left buried. Elena stared out of the window of her hospital room, the city's lights blurring into streaks of gold against the night sky. The pain of betrayal had settled into her bones, a cold, gnawing ache that refused to fade. Each new revelation had chipped away at her trust, leaving her feeling hollow and lost. But nothing had prepared her for what she was about to learn. The knock on the door was soft, hesitant. She turned, expecting to see a nurse, but instead, Daniel Porter stood in the doorway. His face was drawn, the usual cocky arrogance replaced by something darker, more somber. It had been years since they'd last spoken, but the sight of him still stirred a complex mix of emotions in her: anger, regret, and something that felt almost like pity. "Elena," he said, his voice rough around the edges, "we need to talk." She didn't respond immediately, her mind racing with possibilities. He had been part of her past, a mistake she had tried to forget, but now he was back, dragged into the mess that had become her life. She gestured for him to come in, her expression guarded. Daniel closed the door behind him, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't meet her eyes as he approached the bed, and that alone set off alarm bells in her mind. "What is it, Daniel?" she asked, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. He finally looked at her, and what she saw in his eyes made her heart skip a beat. There was guilt there, deep and consuming, but also fear. He was a man haunted by his own actions, and she knew then that whatever he was about to say would change everything. "I need to confess something," he began, the words heavy with regret. "I didn't want to. I swear to God, I didn't want to, but—" "Just say it," Elena interrupted, her patience frayed to the breaking point. Daniel took a deep breath, his shoulders slumping as he forced the words out. "I was the one who poisoned you." The room seemed to tilt, the air sucked out of it as Elena's mind struggled to process what she had just heard. For a moment, she couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The man standing before her, the man she had once loved, had tried to kill her. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. Why? The question slipped from her lips, barely audible, but it carried the weight of all the betrayal she had endured. Daniel looked down at his hands, clenching and unclenching them as if trying to gather the strength to continue. "I didn't want to do it," he repeated, his voice cracking. "But Richard, your father, he paid me. He said it was the only way. That you were going to inherit everything, and he couldn't let that happen." Elena felt as if the ground had opened up beneath her. Her father, her own father, had hired Daniel to kill her. The man who had raised her, who had claimed to love her, had wanted her dead for the sake of money. It was a truth too monstrous to comprehend, yet here it was, staring her in the face. "No," she whispered, shaking her head as if she could deny the reality before her. "He wouldn't, he couldn't." But deep down, she knew it was true. The pieces of the puzzle she had been trying to put together finally clicked into place. Richard's coldness, his distance, the way he had always controlled her life, it all made sense now. He had never seen her as his daughter, only as an obstacle, something to be removed when it became inconvenient. Daniel's voice broke through her thoughts, desperate and pleading. "I never meant for it to go this far. I thought it would be something quick, painless. But then you didn't die, and I panicked. I didn't know what to do. I'm so sorry, Elena. Please, you have to believe me." Elena stared at him, her anger simmering just beneath the surface. She wanted to lash out, to scream at him for what he had done, but what was the point? He was just a pawn in Richard's game, a tool used to achieve a twisted goal. Her real enemy was the man she had once called father. Without a word, she turned away from Daniel, her mind already working on what needed to be done. She couldn't afford to wallow in betrayal or anger. Not now. Richard had tried to kill her, and she couldn't allow him to get away with it. Mariana was the first person she thought of. The woman who had brought her into the world, who had saved her life twice now, once at birth, and once again when she was on the brink of death. She was the only person Elena could trust, the only one who could help her take down Richard. "I need to see Mariana," Elena said, her voice firm with resolve. Daniel nodded, understanding without needing further explanation. He stepped back, his expression a mix of relief and sorrow. "She's downstairs, waiting. I'll bring her up." When Mariana entered the room a few minutes later, Elena felt a surge of relief. The older woman's presence was calming, a reminder that she wasn't alone in this. Mariana sat beside her, her eyes full of concern, but also a steely determination that mirrored Elena's own. "I know what we have to do," Elena said, her voice steady. "We have to expose him. Richard. He's the one behind all of this." Mariana nodded, her expression grim. "I suspected as much. He's dangerous, Elena. We have to be careful." Elena reached out, taking Mariana's hand in hers. "We'll be careful, but we have to act. We need evidence, something that ties him to the poisoning. And then we take it to the police." Mariana squeezed her hand, her gaze unwavering. "I'm with you. Whatever it takes, we'll bring him down." The two women, bound by blood and now by purpose, began to plot their next steps. They would gather the evidence they needed, expose Richard for the monster he was, and make sure he paid for what he had done. But they both knew it wouldn't be easy. Richard was cunning, and he wouldn't go down without a fight. As if on cue, the door to Elena's room burst open, and Richard stormed in, his face a mask of fury. He had overheard enough of their conversation to know what they were planning, and the look in his eyes sent a shiver down Elena's spine. "I knew it," Richard spat, his voice low and menacing. "You've turned against me. Both of you." Elena stood her ground, her heart pounding in her chest. "We know what you did, Richard. We're going to the police. You can't stop us." A dangerous smile curved his lips as he took a step closer. "Oh, but I can. And I will." Before Elena could react, Richard lunged at them, his hands outstretched, his intention clear. But Mariana was quicker. With a strength Elena hadn't expected, Mariana shoved him back, her voice fierce. "Stay away from her, Richard. You've done enough damage." Richard stumbled but quickly regained his balance, his eyes narrowing in rage. "You think you can stop me? You think anyone will believe you?" Elena's fear turned to anger, her voice rising with the force of her conviction. "We don't need anyone to believe us. We have the truth, and that's more powerful than anything you have." The tension in the room was electric, each of them poised for the next move. But before Richard could make it, the door opened again, and this time, Detective Hansen stood in the doorway, his gaze locking onto Richard. "It's over, Mr. Blackwood," Hansen said, his voice calm but authoritative. "We have enough to arrest you for attempted murder." Richard's eyes widened in shock, and for a moment, he seemed to deflate, the fight draining out of him. He looked at Elena, something almost like regret flashing in his eyes, but it was too late for that. As Hansen stepped forward to take him into custody, Elena felt a surge of relief, but also a deep, aching sorrow. This was her father, the man who had raised her, who had been her world for so long. But he was also the man who had betrayed her in the worst possible way. As the police led Richard away, Elena turned to Mariana, her heart heavy but resolute. "It's over," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The room was quiet, save for the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor that had become a constant backdrop in Elena's life over the past few days. She sat by the window, the pale morning light casting long shadows across the floor. The events of the previous night played in her mind like a twisted nightmare. Richard, her father, no, not her father, she reminded herself, had been led away in handcuffs, the truth of his betrayal hanging heavy in the air. But the relief she felt was tempered by the uncertainty of what came next. Mariana sat across from her, her expression calm but weary. The night had taken its toll on both of them, but they were united by a shared determination. The police had Richard in custody, but they both knew that the battle wasn't truly over. Richard was powerful, with connections that ran deep. He would fight to maintain his empire, even from behind bars. But Elena wasn't going to let him win. Not this time. I've spoken to a lawyer, Elena said, breaking the silence. Her voice was firm, resolute. We have everything we need to press charges. Not just for the attempted murder, but for all the crimes he's committed over the years. His empire is going to fall. Mariana nodded, though her eyes were distant, her thoughts clearly elsewhere. Elena knew what was weighing on her. Richard might have been the immediate threat, but the shadows of the past had a way of creeping back, no matter how much they tried to bury them. There's something I need to tell you, Mariana said, her voice soft, hesitant. She looked at Elena with a mixture of love and fear, as though the words she was about to speak might shatter the fragile bond they had only just begun to rebuild. Elena's heart tightened. After everything, she wasn't sure she could handle more secrets, more revelations that would upend her life again. But she also knew Mariana wouldn't keep something from her unless it was important. What is it? Elena asked, bracing herself. Mariana took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she clasped them together. The reason I gave you up, it wasn't just because of Richard, or because of the political situation in our country. There was something else, something much darker. I thought I could protect you by keeping you away, by letting you grow up in a safe, privileged world. Elena frowned, confusion and apprehension swirling in her mind. Protect me from what? Mariana's gaze dropped to her hands, her voice barely above a whisper. A cult. A dangerous, fanatical group that believed you were special, that you had some kind of power they wanted to harness. They called themselves the Celestial Order. They believed in rituals, sacrifices. Horrible things. When you were born, I knew I couldn't let them have you. Elena's blood ran cold as the implications of Mariana's words sank in. A cult. It sounded like something out of a horror movie, but the fear in Mariana's voice was real. And if what she was saying was true, then Elena's life had been in danger long before Richard had ever tried to harm her. They found out about you, Mariana continued, her voice growing more strained with each word. They found out who you were, who your father was. I tried to protect you, to hide you, but they were relentless. They threatened me, blackmailed me. That's when he stepped in. He offered to take you, to raise you as his own. I didn't trust him, but I had no other choice. I thought he could keep you safe. Elena's mind raced, piecing together the fragments of her past that had never quite made sense. The secrecy, the way Richard had always kept her so close, yet so distant. The sense that there was something lurking beneath the surface of her seemingly perfect life. And now, the final piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. Why are you telling me this now? Elena asked, her voice trembling. Are they still out there? Mariana looked up, her eyes filled with a fear that Elena had never seen before. I don't know. I hoped they had disappeared, that they had moved on after all these years. But something's changed. I've been getting calls, strange messages. I think they're coming back, Elena. And they'll be looking for you. Elena felt a surge of anger, a defiant spark that cut through her fear. She had spent her entire life being manipulated, lied to, and used. But she wasn't a child anymore. She wasn't helpless. "We'll fight them," she said, her voice firm. "Just like we fought Richard. We won't let them win." Mariana's eyes glistened with tears, but there was pride there too, and a fierce determination that mirrored Elena's own. "We'll do it together," she agreed. "But you need to be careful. They're dangerous, and they'll stop at nothing to get what they want." As they sat together, planning their next steps, neither of them noticed the shadow that had fallen across the doorway. Richard, released on bail through the connections that had always kept him above the law, had returned. His face was a mask of fury, his eyes dark with the realization that he had lost control. Without warning, he lunged at them, his movements fueled by desperation. But Mariana, always alert, always protective, reacted in an instant. She threw herself in front of Elena, taking the full force of Richard's attack. They crashed to the floor, Mariana's body shielding Elena from the impact. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Elena watched in horror as Richard tried to overpower Mariana, his hands closing around her throat. But Mariana fought back with a strength born of a mother's love and a lifetime of survival. She struggled against him, refusing to give in, even as her strength began to wane. "No!" Elena screamed, grabbing the nearest object, a heavy metal lamp, and swinging it with all her might at Richard's head. The blow landed with a sickening thud, and Richard collapsed, unconscious. Elena dropped the lamp, her hands shaking, as she rushed to Mariana's side. Blood trickled from a cut on Mariana's forehead, and her breathing was labored, but she was alive. Relief flooded through Elena, followed by a surge of guilt. Mariana had once again risked everything for her. "I'm sorry," Elena whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry." Mariana reached up, her hand trembling as she cupped Elena's cheek. "Don't be sorry," she whispered, her voice weak but full of love. "You're my daughter. I'd do anything for you." The police arrived moments later, alerted by the commotion. Richard was taken into custody again, this time with no chance of release. His empire, already teetering on the brink, collapsed as the full extent of his crimes was exposed. His allies deserted him, his fortune was seized, and he was left with nothing. Elena knew that the road ahead would be difficult. She would have to confront the threat of the cult, protect herself and those she loved, and rebuild her life from the ashes of her past. But she wasn't alone. She had Mariana, the mother she had finally found, and together they would face whatever challenges came their way. As Mariana recovered from her injuries, Elena used her influence to clear her mother's name, ensuring that her medical license was restored. It was a small victory, but it was a start, a step toward the redemption that Mariana so richly deserved. And as the days passed, Elena found herself growing stronger, more determined. The scars of her past would always be there, but they no longer defined her. She had been broken, betrayed, and nearly destroyed, but she had survived. And now, with Mariana by her side, she was ready to take on whatever the future held. But as they left the hospital together, a sense of unease lingered in the back of Elena's mind. The cult, the celestial order, was still out there, somewhere, watching, waiting. She knew they wouldn't give up easily. They believed she was special, that she had a role to play in their twisted vision of the future. Elena glanced at Mariana, who met her gaze with a look of unwavering determination. Whatever the cult had planned, whatever dangers lay ahead, they would face them together. They had already survived the ultimate betrayal. Now, they would fight for justice, for redemption, and for each other.